They laughed when his name came up in that room. Every single executive around that table laughed. And then Marlon Brando walked in and nobody was laughing anymore. Hollywood, 1971. The room smelled like cigarettes and money, and the particular kind of arrogance that only flourishes when a group of men have been right too many times. The Paramount Pictures conference table, seated 12. That afternoon, 11 of them agreed on one thing. Marlon Brando was finished. Box office poison. A liability. A nightmare on set. A relic from a decade that nobody wanted to remember. The 12th man, a young director named Francis Ford Coppola, nervous, relatively unknown, desperately clinging to the one project he believed could define his entire career, sat quietly and said nothing. Because if he pushed too hard, they'd take the movie away from him too. What happened in the weeks that followed is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of cinema. Not just because of what Marlon Brando did in that audition room, but because of who he was before he walked into it. Because you need to understand just how far this man had fallen before you can truly understand what it meant for him to rise again. And what it cost him, and what in the end he chose to do with it all. Because the real story doesn't end with the performance. It ends with a night in April 1973, when the most powerful man in Hollywood sat alone while an entire auditorium waited for him and made the most defiant decision of his life. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where this actually begins. Marlon Brando in 1971 was 47 years old. If you'd told someone on the street that this man was about to deliver what many critics and filmmakers would later call the greatest screen performance of the 20th century, they would have looked at you like you'd lost your mind. The Brando that Hollywood knew in 1971 was not the Brando of A Streetcar Named Desire. He was not the Brando of On the Waterfront, the man who made the entire film industry stop and reconsider what acting even meant. That Brando felt like ancient history. The Brando of 1971 was defined in the eyes of the industry by failure, not personal failure. Brando had never seemed particularly concerned with what the industry thought of him personally, but commercial failure, the kind that closes doors, the kind that makes studios go quiet when your name enters the conversation. He had made a string of films that lost money. He had a reputation for being difficult, for showing up unprepared, for improvising when directors wanted precision. He had been called egomaniacal, unprofessional, impossible. And by the late 1960s, Marlon Brando was not a star that studios were rushing toward. He was a risk, a brilliant, historically significant risk that almost nobody wanted to take anymore. But here's the thing. Those 11 men around that conference table did not understand. And this is the part of the story that matters most. So stay with me here. They were measuring the wrong thing entirely. They were measuring Brando's commercial value against a version of Hollywood that was already dying. What they could not see, what perhaps only Coppola and a handful of others could see, was that the project on the table was not just another movie. It was something that demanded a different kind of actor entirely. Something that could only work if the man at its center was not simply good but transformative. The project was Mario Puzo's The Godfather. If you were alive in the 1970s, you already know what that name means. You already feel it somewhere in your chest. That particular weight that comes with certain titles, certain stories, certain pieces of art that lodge themselves so deeply into the culture that you can't remember a time before them. But in 1971, before a single frame had been shot, The Godfather was just a novel. A bestseller, yes, it had captured something real about power and family and the American dream and the cost of protecting the people you love. But a novel is just words on paper until someone makes you believe it. Making you believe it required one thing above everything else. Vito Corleone had to be real. Vito Corleone, the aging patriarch of a Sicilian-American crime family. A man of terrifying power and unexpected tenderness. A man who could order a killing and weep at a wedding with equal authenticity. This character required an actor who could hold contradictions the way a great musician holds a chord. Not performing the contradiction, living it, breathing it, making you forget entirely that you're watching a performance at all. Francis Ford Coppola knew exactly who that actor was. He had known from the beginning, and the fact that every executive at Paramount disagreed with him was not, in Coppola's mind, evidence that he was wrong. It was evidence that they didn't understand what they were looking at. But understanding something and being able to prove it are two very different things. Coppola needed to prove it to the men who controlled the money, and the only way to prove it was to show them Marlon Brando becoming Vito Corleone right in front of their eyes. The problem was, Paramount had explicitly said they did not want Brando anywhere near this film. They had listed their reasons: his box office failures, his reputation, the insurance complications, the risk to the production schedule. Every concern was legitimate on paper. Every concern was, from a purely business perspective, completely reasonable. And if you're the kind of person who has spent the last 40 or 50 years watching people in power use reasonable-sounding arguments to shut down things that matter, and most of us by now have seen that particular game played more times than we'd like to count, then you already know exactly what Coppola was facing. A wall built out of logic that was entirely correct and entirely beside the point. So Coppola arranged what was essentially an unofficial audition. He would bring Brando in, set up a camera, and let the man do what he did. Then he would show the footage to the people who had already said no. Because sometimes the only argument that works against a closed mind is something so undeniable that closing your eyes no longer becomes an option. But first, he had to convince Brando. Here's where the story gets complicated in a way most people don't fully appreciate. Because Marlon Brando in 1971 was not a man desperate for this role. He was not sitting by the phone hoping someone would call. He was not hungry in the way that young actors are hungry, that raw need that makes people willing to endure almost anything for a chance to prove themselves. Brando had been there. He had proven himself more thoroughly than almost anyone in the history of his profession. And what had all of it given him? A complicated life, a public existence that he had in many ways come to resent. Fame that felt less like a gift and more like a trap built around him while he was busy being exceptional. By the early 1970s, he had serious doubts about whether the entire enterprise of Hollywood was worth the damage it required. If you've ever felt that particular exhaustion, not from failure but from winning in a system you've started to suspect was never worth winning in, then you understand something of what Brando was carrying. Not everyone has been famous, but most of us by the time we've lived a few decades have worked hard for something only to arrive and wonder whether the destination was what we actually wanted. That hollowness. Brando knew it better than almost anyone. And yet, when Coppola described Vito Corleone to him, something shifted, because the character wasn't a display. Vito Corleone was a man who held enormous power and chose, consistently, to exercise it quietly. A man whose strength came not from volume or aggression, but from an almost preternatural stillness. A man who understood that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who doesn't need to prove anything. Sound familiar? Brando read the character and recognized something. Not vanity. Not "this is like me." Something deeper. The recognition that this was a character he could inhabit completely because the emotional truth was something he had been living in various forms for years. The wariness and the authority. The love alongside the capacity for absolute ruthlessness. He said yes, and then he did something nobody expected. He showed up to the audition without having memorized a single line. He had instead spent his preparation time doing something entirely different. He had sat in front of a mirror. He had thought about age and weight and the physical reality of a man like Corleone, someone whose power has calcified over decades into something almost geological. He had thought about the voice, not the voice of a movie gangster, not the familiar sound audiences had heard in dozens of crime films, but the specific voice of a specific man, an immigrant who built an empire and now holds it the way you hold something precious and heavy, with both hands always aware of its weight. He took some cotton, he stuffed it into his cheeks, he slicked his hair back. He looked in the mirror one more time, and Marlon Brando disappeared. What Coppola saw when the camera started rolling was not an actor preparing to play a character. It was Vito Corleone, already fully formed, already completely real, sitting in a chair and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. The cotton in his cheeks had changed the architecture of his face. The slicked hair had changed the lines around his eyes, but those were surface details. What was not surface, what was not detail, was the absolute certainty that came through the lens. The sense that this man had been alive for 70 years before the camera turned on. That he had built something, lost people he loved, made choices he would never discuss, and arrived at a peace indistinguishable from power. The crew present went very quiet. When it was over, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Coppola looked at the person nearest to him and said, quietly, that he thought they had something. That was an understatement, so vast it bordered on the poetic. Now, if you're finding this story as remarkable as we do, this is exactly the moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Because every week we tell stories like this one. Moments when someone does something so unexpected and so true that it changes everything around them, and the story isn't over. Not even close. What comes next is the part that stays with you. The footage was shown to the Paramount executives who had laughed when Brando's name came up. They watched it in silence. And when it was over, the room that had been full of certainty, full of box office numbers and insurance complications, and the entirely reasonable arguments for why this should not happen, was full of something else entirely. One executive, by multiple accounts, said nothing at all. He simply nodded. Another, who had been among the most vocal opponents of the casting, reportedly said that he hadn't recognized him, not immediately, that he had watched for nearly a full minute before he realized who he was looking at. Because what was on that screen was not Marlon Brando giving a performance. It was a human being who had become someone else while the camera was running. They gave him the role. What followed was the making of a film that would become one of the most celebrated in cinema history. The Godfather was released in March 1972. The response was not measured critical approval. It was something closer to a cultural earthquake. Lines around the block. Audiences who came back multiple times, not because the plot required it, but because they couldn't quite believe what they had seen. Within weeks, it became clear this was not just a successful film. It was a before and after moment for American cinema. And at the center of it, undeniably, was Brando. Critics who had written him off were writing new pieces. Studios that had blacklisted his name were calling his agents. The man described as box office poison less than 2 years earlier was suddenly, inescapably, the most acclaimed actor in the world. Then the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated him for Best Actor. This is the part where most accounts end Brando wins. Standing ovation. The confirmation that the doubters were wrong and the believer was right. A clean, satisfying arc. But that's not what happened. And if you think you know what comes next, stay with me, because what actually occurred on the night of April 27, 1973, says more about who Marlon Brando really was than any performance he ever gave on screen. He wasn't there. The entire auditorium was expecting him. The cameras were ready. The audience was ready. When his name was called as the winner, there was that particular electricity of a crowd expecting something memorable, and then a young woman walked to the stage. Her name was Sacheen Littlefeather. She was an Apache activist in traditional Native American dress. And she walked to that microphone and told the audience, told Hollywood, told the watching world, that Marlon Brando was declining the award. She carried a statement from him, 15 pages in his handwriting, which the producers threatened to prevent her from reading in full. She summarized it in 60 seconds. The reason Brando was refusing the Oscar, she explained, was the treatment of Native Americans by the film industry and by the United States government. He was declining the most prestigious award his profession could offer at the moment of his greatest triumph in order to make a statement about people who had no other platform, people whose stories were not being told, people being harmed by the same system that was, that very night, celebrating him. The auditorium booed. Some applauded. Most were simply stunned. You can agree with his decision or disagree with it. That debate has gone on for 50 years, and it isn't going to be settled here. But the question it raises is one that doesn't have an easy answer. What do you do when you've won the game? When the system that spent years doubting you has finally confirmed what you always knew? When the prize is in your hands, what do you do if you've decided the prize itself is part of the problem? Most people take the prize, and there's nothing wrong with that. The world is hard, recognition matters, and taking it is not a moral failure. Taking it is human. But Brando had learned early that the things the world told you to want were not always the things worth wanting. He had learned to distrust received wisdom. The boy who grew up in Nebraska with a distant father and a mother whose struggles carved particular shapes into his understanding of what strength really looked like. That boy had developed an instinct for questioning the assumptions underneath every surface that everyone else took for granted. That instinct had made him a revolutionary actor. It had also made him, by the industry's measure, deeply inconvenient. He had given the Godfather everything: the preparation, the physical transformation, the emotional excavation of something true and difficult inside himself. He had given them a performance that would be studied and admired and imitated for the rest of the century and beyond. And in return, they offered him the Oscar, the highest validation their system could produce. And he looked at that validation on the night it was offered, and he thought about the people who never got offered anything. The people whose land had been taken, whose culture had been appropriated, whose stories had been told wrong or not told at all by the very industry now placing a golden statuette in his hands. And he made his choice. Not because he calculated it would play well, because it was, for him, the only honest response available. In the years after The Godfather, Brando's relationship with his own fame continued to be, to put it gently, complicated. He made films that were extraordinary. He made choices that confused the industry. He retreated eventually to a private island in French Polynesia, Tetiaroa, a place he loved for its remoteness, for the peace of being somewhere the machinery of Hollywood could not easily reach. He gave interviews that were fascinating and maddening in equal measure. He challenged interviewers. He answered questions he hadn't been asked, and declined to answer the questions he had. He was, in short, exactly the person he had always been. Marlon Brando died on July 1st, 2004. He was 79 years old. He died at a Los Angeles hospital, largely away from the spotlight, on his own terms, in the relative quiet he had spent so much of his career pursuing and so much of his celebrity being denied. The world's response was immediate. Every major outlet ran retrospectives. Directors and actors and critics who had worked with him or been influenced by him offered their recollections of his generosity, of his genius, of his difficulty, of the way he could walk into a scene and rearrange everything around him without seeming to try. But the story that kept coming back, in almost every account, was the Godfather, the audition, the cotton in the cheeks, and the slicked back hair, and the voice that came out barely above a whisper and somehow said everything. The image of Marlon Brando in 1971, a man written off, diminished, whose name made executives laugh, becoming Vito Corleone in a room full of people who hadn't believed it was possible. Francis Ford Coppola returned to that moment repeatedly in interviews across the decades. He described it as one of the most extraordinary things he had ever witnessed. He described the silence in the room when the footage played back. He described the particular quality of what Brando had done, the way it was not, in any conventional sense, a performance at all. It was transformation. It was the thing that performance at its highest level aspires to be and almost never quite reaches. Coppola believed in Brando when the evidence argued against it. That belief and Brando's willingness to honor it with everything he had produced something that outlasted them both. That outlasted everyone in that room. That outlasted the studio system that had declared him finished. That outlasted the critics and the box office analysts and everyone else whose job it was to measure and quantify and assess. Think about that for a moment. Because this is the part of the story that gets buried under the legend, under the awards and the cultural impact and the endlessly quoted lines. Think about where Brando was in 1971. 47 years old, the age that many people in any field begin to feel the ceiling closing in. The age when the industry had decided his story was over. Think about what it means to walk into a room carrying years of failures and a reputation you didn't entirely deserve, and to stuff cotton in your cheeks and become someone else entirely. And to do it so completely that the people who had just finished laughing at your name couldn't recognize your face. There is something in that story that belongs to all of us. Not the fame, not the Oscar, not the particular circumstances of Hollywood in 1971. But the thing underneath all of that, the idea that the conclusions other people draw about you, even when they're reasonable, even when they're backed by evidence, even when they make perfect sense on paper, are not the final word. That the most important audition you'll ever give is the one that happens after everyone has already made up their minds. Brando walked into that room knowing they'd already said no. He walked in anyway. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't defend his past or promise a different future. He simply sat down, stuffed cotton in his cheeks, found the voice of an old man who had nothing left to prove, and told the truth. And when he was done, the room had changed. That is what it means to give everything. That is what it means to walk back in after they've already said no. And that is why, when the name Marlon Brando comes up, even now, long after everyone who laughed in that conference room is gone, something happens. Something quiet and undeniable. Something that feels a little bit like recognition. Like you're in the presence of someone who understood something true and chose to say it out loud. Even when nobody was asking. Even when everyone in the room had already made up their minds.